Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to introduce to you Christina Frost. She's from Elastic, and they have been a customer of ours for a while, and they're doing some amazing things in sales related to basically capturing all the data around their communication and using this to inform how they are both following up with customers, renewing customers, selling better, and so on. And it's an amazingly run sales team, and she can tell you all the details of how they're using this to drive kind of their process. So.
Yeah.
Just want to introduce you.
All right, great. I am really excited to be here. My name is Christina Frost. I manage technology and operations at Elastic. And so what that means is I'm in charge of architecting our sales stack, but I'm also in charge of territory operations, data quality, and renewal operations. And when Chris and I first got started talking about the possibility of doing this talk, I sort of thought, well, okay, if you're going to hear from someone who's going to chat a little bit about Groove, most of the things that you've heard before have probably been pre-sales use cases, like things like how do I get sales development to log their emails and make sure that they're doing what I expect them to be doing in terms of reach out. And so I was like, why don't we do something a little different, and let's talk about like a post-sales renewals type use case. And so I'm going to go over how we've created what we call our early warning system for renewals and the part that Groove plays in that. But I'd like this session to be kind of interactive. So if you have a question at any point in time, I will not be offended if you interrupt me. And I would really encourage you to kind of do that. So a word about us beforehand, because I think some of these things are a little bit important for understanding how we built this model. Elastic is the company behind the open source technologies Elasticsearch, Logstash, Beats, and Kibana. And we've been really lucky with the open source community to get this kind of viral adoption of the open source side of our technology. So we have over 65,000 users in our developer community. We're approaching 70 million downloads. And we have 2,400 subscription customers. So the subscription, you have to engage with us typically on an annual contract. You get access to commercial features that are not available in the open source. By doing that, you also receive support. And so this subscription business is why the renewals modeling that we do is so important to us, right? Because it gives us predictability in our business to be able to know and predict, hey, we think that our renewal rate over the next few periods is going to be X, right? And with the modeling that we've been doing, we're within about 2 to 4 percentage points of accuracy every month. So that's been really, really exciting. Our customer base is across all industries, and I'll chat about that in just a second because I think for some of you, some of your products may be industry specific, and so industry might be more of an indicator for renewals for you than it was for us. But because we're kind of cross-industry, we haven't really seen much firmographic impact, and I'm going to be talking about firmographics quite a little bit later in the presentation. So, sorry. Let's get to like the actual meat of the stuff, which is this is the question I wanted us to answer in the course of this session, which is like, how do I get a data-driven predictive measure of customer health? And one of the things I wanted to solve for our sales team was there's kind of this classic behavior, I'm sure all of you have seen it, where it's like you land in the month and people forecast for whatever's in that month. And whatever's like 2 or 3 months from now, or like 4 or 5 months from now, forget about it, right? Like no one is forecasting for that. And that's really problematic, I think, for renewals, because if you walk in that month to a renewal engagement and you don't actually know what's going on 30 days before, you don't have enough time to save that customer. Like if they're actually not happy with you, or if there's something that's negative in their adoption, 30 days is not enough time for you to rescue them. So let me talk about how we built this model. There's 5 steps, and I'm going to go through kind of all 5 of these in more detail in just a moment. The first one is to just sit around with the smartest people that you think you have at your company and like throw stuff at a wall in terms of things that you think might be contributing factors. And I'll give you an example of one thing that like we thought would be a contributing factor, and we looked into it and it wasn't, and that was training. So for us, we were all like, oh man, if we train all of the support contacts on our subscriptions, like the renewal rate must logically be better. And we looked into it. There's all the smartest people in the room, like based on anecdotes, thinking that this is proven. We actually ran the statistics on it. There was no correlation. There was no positive correlation. There was no negative correlation. And so we were like, okay, training is not actually a contributing factor, right? So some of these things executives are going to have really strong opinions on, like, oh man, we always renew in financial services. And then like you'll actually look at the data and you'll be like, we don't, right? Or whatever. So some of this is just like getting a list of people's opinions about what are the most important features, what are the customer sizes that we actually want, what kinds of touch points do we think are impactful, and then actually figuring out how to compare them. And that takes you into step 2. So step 2 is, on this list, you're going to have some things that you already have in your CRM system, and you're going to have a bunch of things that you don't have in your CRM system, or can't figure out how to track, or can't figure out how to stabilize. The things that you do have in your system, you can kind of start testing on, because you shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? So you can kind of be like, hey, there's 10 factors that we think influence a renewal. We only have 5 of them in our system now, so the first edition of our early warning system is only going to consider those 5 that we have, and we can predict. And the next editions are going to be built on our ability to figure out how we're going to capture those other 5 factors that we want. I'll talk about factors a little bit more in a second. Scoring is going to be once you've locked on those things that are going to make it, that you do have captured and you can predict. The renewal rate itself should tell you how many points you're going to assign or not assign, if it's a negative factor, to a raw score, right? So let's say that you are a seat license company, and you've observed that if over 70% of your users have logged in the last 30 days on this seat license model, you're very confident that you're going to renew. All the customers who've done that, you've seen a 95% renewal rate. And let's say that's higher than your average, right? That's like 15 points higher than your average, and that's statistically pretty significant. And in that case, in your raw score, you're going to weight that indicator more heavily, right? To say, based on the adoption of our technology, we feel like these people are strong customers. The last one is, the second last here is monitoring customer health. So I'll talk about this in a second, but we roll this up into a score. We use that score to report, forecast, and predict renewals. And then the last one is alerting. So we've attached a lot of like chatter alerts and things like that to our territory structures inside of our CRM instance. And that means if we see 90 days out that we think that a renewal is unhealthy based on all the adoption measures that we see from the customer, or based on the touch points that we actually see people doing, like it looks like they haven't spoken to a human in the last 30 days or whatever, then we start activating team members like the rep, the solutions architect, the customer success manager, the AVP, that sort of thing, to really escalate to them to say, this, like, you have this in a forecast category that looks like you think it's going to renew, and we're super confident it's not, in fact, going to renew, and you need to do something about that. So that's kind of what we do. For contributing factors, I can chat a little bit about what our contributing factors are, but I wanted to make it more broad. Before I worked for Elastic, which is an open source company, I worked for Salesforce. And so I was also kind of thinking of these other subscription model companies and the sorts of features that they would be looking at. And so human activities are going to be things like, do you have a customer success manager, and have they gone on site? Or have they had a meeting with the customer? Have you had product management do a roadmap session? Have you had a solutions architect to go and engage with them about the best way to use whatever your technology or product is? And have they had good support experiences? So 2 kind of call outs here. The first one is, as Chris mentioned, we're a Groove user. So Groove makes these first 4 things pretty easy for us to figure out, which is really nice. Like the email side installation aspect of Groove in terms of its logging means that we don't really have to ask people to log activities anymore. We just read their calendar. And we're like, oh, okay, Chris met with Doug at Elastic, so the Groove renewal must be looking pretty good, right? So we can figure that out. Good support experiences, I think this one is interesting because we use Service Cloud, but before we use Service Cloud, we used Zendesk. And I think whatever your method is for support, you need some way to mine case data. Because case data, to me, is another thing that you shouldn't have to ask your reps for. Like if a customer is logging a ticket that says, hello, I have a problem with this feature, you shouldn't have to ask your rep or a solutions architect or a CSM whether or not the customer is using that feature. Like there should be no form that someone on your sales team has to fill out to capture that information, because the customer is giving it to you, like they are crowdsourcing it for you via cases, right? So I think that's an area. CSATs are kind of the same if you're doing customer satisfaction surveys. I think this is the same thing where you need to kind of think about how can I aggregate those on my contracts so that I can see, satisfaction from them. Question? I think it is. I have another preso on that I might pull up at the end that I did a little bit of a presentation on if we have time. I would say for this purpose, for renewals, it's more important that you have like a contract structure of some type, or that you have an end date on your existing opportunity so that you actually know like, okay, this is going to end at X point of time, because that's going to be your container mechanism for like, what set of renewals am I looking at, that date concept. Then it doesn't matter so much which account it gets attached to contractually. There are some cool things that our team does in terms of account hierarchy that help with planning. If we have time at the end, I'll grab a different laptop and I'll do a switcheroo and pull that up and talk about it. The account data piece, to answer that question a little bit further, though, gets into firmographics. And I'll give you a bit of a cautionary warning about firmographics, which is that if you look at your renewal rates across, like, let's say you're a company that does segmentation, and you segment by annual revenue, and you observe that your smallest customers that, let's say, have less than $10 million in annual revenue, tend not to renew with you. You cannot develop an early warning system that just penalizes those customers, that just says, no matter what, we can't get those customers to green, or we can't get those customers to 100%. Because if you do, you're sending a very strange message to your SMB sales team, which is that it's harder for them to close renewals, or that it's impossible for them to be perfect. So when you develop a score here, you really want this, if you're going to use a firmographic element like someone's size or someone's industry, you still want someone to be able to make the grade, right? Like you want to be able to get them to green. It might be that you need to see, in order for those smaller customers to be green, you need to see like 3 or 4 more good indicators over here. So it can be harder to get to green, but it should never be impossible. You should never go, oh, okay, my small customer, because they're small, I'm going to dock them, down to yellow, no matter what. So firmographics, a little bit of caution here. And I do think if you want to do things off of industry size or revenue, in terms of looking at this stuff in an algorithm, the account data piece becomes really important, because you can't have 3 Microsofts and one of them is a subsidiary and only shows 20 employees. Like, that's not going to help you. Microsoft is a massive company. You need to be scoring them as though they're a massive company. So that is something I think to be thoughtful about. But that's an area where, again, like I was saying a minute ago, if you feel like you don't have this part sorted out, it shouldn't stop you from starting to think about how you could get a warning system in place using these 2 parts, which you might have. And then you can build a roadmap around getting your account data to be better. Usage and features. So I'll go back to my time at Salesforce a little bit, which is that, and hopefully we all know this, right? But like Salesforce knows how many custom objects you have. It knows how many times your users have logged in. It knows how many times you've run reports. They have a list of how many workflow rules you've done. And so if you're a company like that, where like people are logging into your app and you are tracking what it is that they're doing in there, then I think you have awesome usage data. And you should be trying to figure out what is the stickiest usage data, which, for Salesforce, maybe it's something like custom objects. Like people who are building lots of custom objects must have a lot of business process that they're putting into their CRM system, right? And that's sticky. That makes it harder to leave Salesforce to go somewhere else. So that's an example in that type of an offering. If you were like a cloud storage offering, you might be looking at, has their storage grown? Like, if they're contracted with us and we see that they're storing more and more files with us, that's a good indicator, right? And so you may not have that, like, they ran 300 reports this week type detail, but you would have detail about their storage. And if you're on a seat license model, which we are not, unfortunately, but I kind of wish we were, because I would love to do a sliding scale with license utilization and go, hey, this customer is entitled to 50 licenses. If they're using all 50, that's awesome. If they're using 25, that's pretty bad. So, so these are the kinds of things that we think about in our contributing factors. For us, because we have this kind of open source infrastructure offering, we have to do a lot more work over here to kind of make up for what I would characterize as a lack of data, or like, I wish we had more information here. And then because our product is sort of use case agnostic, we don't get as much of a boost from industry as I would have hoped, coming from kind of previous experience, which some of you may know that like you have a really strong healthcare use case, but you need to do some more work in financial services, for example. And so for your healthcare customers, it might be faster or easier for them to get to green or A or whatever you want to call your score finally, But for those financial services customers, you may need to see a couple more positive indicators in your algorithm. So that's how we think about it. I'm going to give Groove another plug here. A lot of people at Elastic are ex-Salesforcers. My IT peer is also an ex-Google for Work person. And so this is a quote from someone who used to be a rep at Salesforce, used to use Salesforce IQ, and they love Groove, which for me, like, I don't like being the sales operations or sales tech bad guy. Like, I don't like telling them to log activities. I don't like being Big Brother. And so the fact that they're just like, oh, I just install it and then you leave me alone. And I'm like, yeah, that's all you do. And then they're like, terrific. But there's other aspects that they really like around being able to set up flows and things like that for coming up on renewal campaigns. So like, hi, customer, I haven't heard from you in 90 days. I was just wondering, could we get coffee sometime? Or is there something you need? That sort of a thing. They can kind of set up those sorts of flows. When someone responds yes, Groove can go, cool, I don't need to keep emailing them or reminding them. And if someone responds no, it'll kind of wait for like 7 days and send another automated message. So that really helps them be more efficient. And I'll show you a couple things related to that are just screenshots to sort of save time. This background one is the activity one. And so you saw there were a couple of things that I mentioned in our contributing factors, but one of them was like, has a product manager spoken to them about the roadmap? That was a bullet on the previous slide. So we have a checkbox here that says PM engaged. The cool thing about these activity fields that we added and the way that they interact with our calendar, we're a Google Shop, is that only one employee has to set that because the calendar event is shared by everyone. So our SAs do this and no one else thinks about it. Like everyone else just goes to the meeting. And so once it's set once, we get it for everything. We have much less of a failure rate in terms of our activity capture. And the second one was making the things that you do have to capture kind of foolproof. So I mentioned, unlike a company like Salesforce, who really knows what all their users are doing because the users are logging into the app and literally performing actions, we don't know that because you download our license and then you install it to a cluster that we don't have access to. And so in those cases, when we can't mine information from our cases, from our case data, that's where we ask people. But you'll notice we're only asking them for like 5 things. And the only time anyone would fill this out is if they saw that the other activity mining or the case mining was producing a result that they felt was inaccurate. So they do not have to do this for every customer. They only have to do it if they're looking at a subscription and they go, oh, they actually are using Shield, which is our security technology. And because the customer had never logged a case on Shield before, we didn't know that until that moment. And that's the only time we ask for human input, which really, really helps with our adoption because the message to the team is like, we're going to try to do 90% of the legwork so that you only have to do 10. And maybe at other companies, you've had to do 90% of the legwork, and then your technology team or your operations team has done 10. Or they feel that way, right? Because like sales and forms, they hate it. Okay, so on capturing and modeling, one thing that I think the second bullet here, I'm sure if some of you are admins or developers, you probably know this. We plant all of this information, all the aggregation that we do, all the predictions that we do on a custom object that we've created called subscription. And the reason that we created that custom object is our contract vehicles can govern multiple projects. So if I go back to my Salesforce analogy, because it's probably a little bit simpler, it's like Salesforce sold you 4 orgs. We can have contracts that are kind of like that. And so for that reason, we have a contract object, and then we have these 4 subscriptions. If your engagements are one-to-one, you could probably just use contract or opportunity, and you'd be fine. But for us, we kind of had to have this sort of project layer that we think about. So we plant everything on that subscription, and then we roll it up into a contract. And there's one point I want to make there, which is that our subscriptions can be different sizes, right? So one customer might have, let's say, 4 subscriptions, 2 of them have 25 nodes, 1 of them has 100, and 1 of them has 10. We're going to react differently if that 100 node cluster is the one that has all the negative indicators, because that's where most of the spend is actually attached. If the 10 node cluster has negative indicators, we might be worried, but we are not going to be as profoundly, deeply worried as we would be if the 100 node cluster had negative indicators, right? So we take these subscriptions that we have, and we do a weighted average up to the contract. So we basically say, look, 50% of the contract's prediction just comes off of the fact that there's 4 subscriptions. And the other 50% is a weighted average of those 4 subscriptions based on their size. So it's kind of this blend between we want all of your projects to be healthy, but we also want to give some preference to the instances that you have that are a little bit larger. So I'll chat about scoring next. We take an approach where we do kind of this aggregation and the thinking about the raw score into a literal raw score, where we don't have to care about what it looks like. And so right now it can go up to, for us, 120 points. But if we needed to add another factor tomorrow, for example, we just bought a machine learning company called Prelert. And if someone said, okay, are they using machine learning? If that became an important renewal factor for us, we could add using Prelert type mining indicator. And then the raw score could go up to 140. We don't have to re-educate the reps on what 140 means, because 140 is just like kind of the ops score. And then we have a formula field that takes the 140 and translates it into, and this could be whatever you think is easiest for your team, right? It could be a letter grade, it could be red, yellow, green. We do a probability. So we take a probability and we use that to do expected revenue, which I'll show you on the next slide. But let's suppose that these 4 things are the things that you've started thinking are the most important factors that you have captured today, right? So let's say of these 4 things, if someone has had an executive briefing, the customers who've had an executive briefing renew at a 30% higher rate than the customers who do not. Let's say that the customers who have the highest amount of login utilization, like I was mentioning a minute ago, let's say that they renew at a 20% higher rate than those customers who only see half of their users log in, right? Let's say if they're on your best edition, whatever that looks like, your premium product, they renew at a 10% higher rate than the customers who are on your basic or your SMB edition or whatever that is for you. And then lastly, let's say if they've had an interaction of any type with any human who works for your company in the last 30 days, they renew at a 20% higher rate. You're going to use those percentage points to decide how to allocate these levers. So if I'm doing like a 0 to 100 score, I totally forget which numbers I just said here, but it might be something like this is contributing 30 because this was the biggest one, right? And so 30 points come here if this is true, 20 points come here if this is true, another 15 here, another 20 here, based on what you see in those different renewal rates. And what we do then is, what that means is across all these levers, someone gets a raw score that's like a 72, right? And we don't, as I said, we don't have our sales team worry about the 72. We have them worry about that in trailing 12 months of historicals, customers who have a score of 72 have renewed at a 67% renewal rate. And so we teach them that 67% as a probability measure. And we go, okay, we really only think for this one contract that you're going to collect 67% of the revenue. We don't care what you think. We're telling you the adoption score is at that percentage. We stress test the score every month, actually, which is where that 2 to 4% measure that I came up with comes from. So what we do now with it is every 90 days, we take the renewals forecast and we do it weekly. So weekly, we can see this really funny behavior of the reps and their invincibility going, it's all good, guys, we got this. And so their forecasted renewal rate is going to be like 95%. And our forecasted renewal rate is going to be like 82%. And we just watch them converge for the next 90 days. Because when we start warning them, they go, oh shit, you're right. And they start working on it. So our score starts ticking up because they start doing the human stuff. And their score starts ticking down because they start getting a little less confident, right? And then we meet in the middle in month. So we're kind of getting the behaviors that we want. One comment I have, I was going to say it earlier, I'm going to jump back for just a second. This one's the one that I think is a bummer. I'm going to jump back to features for a minute. Features are the funniest thing for me to work on with our executives because, for example, I mentioned this acquisition, and now everyone's like, oh man, Prelert's going to totally move the needle. Like, machine learning is the new thing. All of our customers are going to renew. And I'm like, it's going to have no impact on renewals for at least 6 months. And they're like, why is that? And I'm like, because none of the customers who are customers today bought our technology because of machine learning. and it's going to take them time to install it. So if they are renewing this month, the fact that we have this cool new machine learning technology is irrelevant, and we won't consider it in the score. So that can be kind of tricky because all of your execs are going to be like, oh man, you've got to take advantage of this new information. And I'm like, yeah, it'd be really awesome if only like 200 customers were using it so that we could draw some meaningful conclusions from it. And so feature adoption, you're really thinking about the features that people bought if you're on an annual contract cycle 12 months ago, right? Have they really made the most of the technology that existed at the time that they bought the contract? And that can be a little bit tricky, I think. Okay, let me get caught back up here. So monitoring. Sorry, this is blurry. I have two things boxed in orange here and one thing boxed in kind of a teal. And what this is these bars, this is a rep, right? Each one of these kind of buckets is a rep. The blue is for us what the original contract was worth. The green, the light green, is what the reps call on the renewal currently is, how much they think that renewal is worth. And the orange is the expected revenue off of this probability that we're forecasting, the probability that I mentioned that we came up with. So the people that I have in orange because their call is at least 50% higher than what reality says is likely to happen today, right? So that's that rep invincibility factor that I was mentioning. The person in teal, to me, looks much, much more likely to achieve their renewals quota because their expected revenue is pretty close to this line green, and that's kind of what we expect. Usually our forecast is slightly more conservative than what really happens. And there's some reasons for that, like we can't account for things like this startup was bought by another company or someone ceased operations or things like that. There's some intangibles that we can't account for, but this teal rep is going to be a lot happier at the end of this period than either of these orange people are. And so this is a couple of things, like if I'm the manager of these individuals, this gives me a ton of warning to get on them soon to say, like, I really don't see this customer using the kinds of things that they need to be using, or we're going to fly you and 3 other people out there, and you're going to go salvage whatever it is that's going on. So that's kind of what the reporting and monitoring can look like. And the last piece I'll touch on is what it looks like for alerting. And so I mentioned we used probability. And so 90 days before, if your renewal is at less than 80% likely to renew, we send a chatter alert out. And so we've said, X customer is at less than 80% likely to renew based on the customer health score. Please see, and that link is a link to the subscription itself, which is where all this information is aggregated, for more information. And the other green bar at the bottom there is the rest of the team. So it's the rep, it's the solutions architect, so our technical resource, and it's the customer success manager. And they're the people who are activated at first. The second one happens 30 days out, and we raise the bar within 30 days to 90%. So your 90-day notice tells you you're at less than 80% likely to renew. You have an uphill climb to do. If you haven't completed that climb up to 90% by the month that you're forecasting in, then we give you another one and we tell your manager. So it is a little bit steeper. But that's kind of it for me in terms of the slides I had prepared. If you guys have questions, terrific. If not, I will pull up that other deck that I mentioned, but I'll pause there for just a second. So, questions, anything? Yeah.
So first of all,
Thanks.
My big question is, how would you include, so it sounds like you guys are a little bit more of a sliding scale where you're increasing nodes, decreasing nodes, so you can apply percentages to it pretty accurately. How would you change this approach for a binary approach where it's a yes or no decision? Because I'm sure other people in the room have had issues with that with forecasting where you're applying probabilities to something that's inherently binary.
Yep.
So how would you incorporate that in what you're talking about today?
Yeah, so I think two things. The first thing is some binary measures can actually be like positive and negative. So we have some measures where in the contributing factors themselves, if we see something that has a negative impact on the renewal rate, we actually take points away. Like it's not all plus 30 points. It's like, this is a bad indicator for us. -10, right? Like it's kind of a wrong answer in terms of how we see things architected. And an example I'll give of that is that we're an infrastructure company. In terms of how you structure your infrastructure, it's recommended that you have at least 3 nodes. If you only have one that's running, we know you have no backup method for like your data, which is terrible. And so that's the kind of like bad behavior that we look for, where we're like, okay, not only has no one been in touch with you, but actually your implementation is not technically sound. And that's like a negative indicator. So sometimes it's not a sliding scale. Sometimes it's like plus 30 points if your architecture is good, minus 20 points if your architecture is bad. But the other question I think you had is like, how do you do it for forecasting? And so that one is, I think that's where you have to think about whether or not you're going to go with a probability, which is what we've chosen, or you're going to go with like a letter grade. Because something like a red, yellow, green, you could basically say, look, if overall the score really looks like this is not going to happen, we're going to keep it in red until you achieve the indicators that make us feel confident about this person as a customer, right? And so in that case, it might be best to do kind of both, because what I like about the probability is the expected revenue aspect. Like for me as a sales strategy person, it's really nice to look like 90 days, 60 days, even 6 months out, and be thinking about whether or not we're going to have a problem in a specific month with regards to our install base. So that's really nice at like a global level or a regional level. But at the transactional level, that's kind of ridiculous because you can't have 33% of a transaction. Like that's just not, that's not true. And so that's an area where I do imagine you could basically say, look, if renewal rate, if the raw score, is equal to a probability of less than X percentage, whatever's right for your business, you could basically say, we're going to assume this transaction's not going to happen at all. Now, we have chosen not to do that, but I do think it could be a totally valid approach depending on kind of how your technology works. It's just not the right approach for us. But does that help?
Yeah, no, because that's exactly what my company is user-based. And we see,
Right, right. So I think in that case, you're going to want to figure out if in your contributing factors, you're going to want to go, who are the people who have gone from 50 to 0? What are the things that we saw? Is it low login utilization? Is it low storage? Is it low record creation? Whatever those things are. And when you see those indicators, you're basically going to want to go, this is not happening. And tell everyone for like 6 months, right? Like shout it on the mountain, this is not going to happen. Like these guys know this, but I'll tell the story anyway. I went to Dreamfest last night. Did anyone else go? Okay, one other person. And it was chaos leaving Dreamfest. It was like totally, did you leave at the end? Yeah, you left at the end. It was madness, right? Okay, my car got broken into. And I was laughing about it on the way in this morning. I mean, I'm bummed and everything, but I was laughing because I'm like, this is a known quantity, right? Like Dreamforce, they knew that this was coming. They knew that they were going to have 100,000 people walking away from the building. It was still a mess. And I think renewals are kind of like that. Like I was kind of laughing this morning. I was like, you have 12 months to know that this event is coming. 12, right? Like if you're on an annual contract and you're a sales rep, you have 12 months to know this coming, and we still see this consistent behavior of like you land in the month and it's like, oh my gosh, I didn't know this was going to happen. And I'm like, no, there was a way to know. There was definitely a way to know. And so, anyway, that's kind of how I think about that. I saw there was another question, maybe a row back. Yeah.
I'm just wondering how complex your predictive model is. Like, is it like data scientists working on it, or like?
It is a 26-year-old analyst who reports to me. And I've made her pretty unhappy sometimes, in all fairness, working on it. We are not using like true data science in this, because one of the things I mentioned about the contributing factors is they're all tested individually. So when I mentioned about like, do you think industry has an impact on your renewal rate? You're just testing, okay, we have 10 customers in this industry, 5 of them didn't renew, so historically that's 50%, and you take that down. What you're not testing for is like, what if they're in industry X and they have 50 seat licenses and they've run reports 300 times this week? We're not really doing that level of data science with it. I would be super interested in anyone who has done that. But for us, we're achieving the level of predictability that we're happy with right now. If we got to a point where our stress testing was starting to reveal flaws in the prediction of that kind of aggregation, then it would have to be something we would have to think about. But right now, single testing each factor in Excel is getting us kind of where we want in terms of prediction. Yeah, I was super happy too.
And how good is your prediction? Like, what do you consider a good, like?
So we want it to be, our target is within 2% of transactions and 5% of dollars. And that's because dollars can have more variability, like a really big deal can totally skew. Like you could have, for us, we have a lot of startups that adopt our technology, and so we could have a startup that's really dependent on our technology go bottoms up. And in that case, we suddenly like lose a six-figure deal, and it can really impact the USD predictability. So we hold ourselves to 2% transactions, 5% USD. We've seen 1 month, which was June, go outside of that. And when we went back into the stress test, we found 3 insolvencies. And so those had like a very serious impact on that 1 month. The rest of the months so far this year, we've been within that bounds. Yep.
Tools, or can you talk a little bit about the tools you've used to do this?
Yeah, so Groove is one that we purchased. We purchased it mostly for the pre-sales thing, but because we have it for the pre-sales thing, I was like, we're going to use it to do this. And so we do use it for renewal operations. We haven't bought other tools. We have a little bit of a preference organizationally to be a build organization instead of a buy organization. So what we do have is a couple of pretty good developers, and I do think if you're going to think about mining cases, for example, like for us, we have a field called product on our cases, and that tells us, if someone's logging a ticket related to a specific feature that we're interested in. If you want to aggregate all of that stuff up, you're probably going to need an Apex developer. And so that has been really essential. We haven't needed a data scientist, but we have absolutely needed like a very strong Apex developer who's able to go look in these related objects and do roll-up summaries. There are a couple of roll-up summary type tools. If you guys are familiar, like Salesforce has, if you have a master detail relationship, you can do counts and averages and things like that of related records. But most people don't have master data relationships on the objects that they're interested in for a variety of reasons. And we don't in this case. And so we can't take advantage of the clicks roll-up summaries. But there is a roll-up helper, and there's an open source roll-up helper that's out on GitHub that you can investigate. We don't use either of them because we have too many leads, but I know of other companies who have used both of them with a lot of success. And both of those roll-up helpers have package install elements that you do, but also configurable elements that like an admin can take advantage of. So those might be a good intermediate option for someone who doesn't have like a really advanced in-house developer. I'm going to move over to my backpack to grab this other laptop really quick. But any other questions while I do that? Okay. So I presented on territory management with Salesforce yesterday, and I'm going to try to steal that deck for just a second because it has a good firmographic element in it. Sorry, thank you. Let me find it. Microphone's got to go down for like 2 minutes. All right, 2 sessions for the price of 1 free session. Nope. Yep, okay. We'll get past all of the Salesforce-y stuff. Just a second. Okay, that was the one I wanted. Nope. Nope. That one. Okay, this on the account data question I had is how we think about our accounts. So we use data.com and we fetch the DUNS numbers. And for any of our accounts, which for my purposes in terms of our policy, we basically say you can have 1 account per country. So there should really only be, like, I go wild with DoBlocker. If there's like 2 Salesforces in the United States, I kill them. Anyway, so that's our policy. I know it can be different for other companies that have other coverage models. So like an example might be Sony Corporation is headquartered in Japan. It has a US headquarters, which I think is in New York, but really big locations both in LA and in New York, logically, right? Because they have the Sony's movies division and they have a music division and they're on opposite coasts. So in that case, your coverage model might say that movies is covered by one rep and music is covered by another rep. And that's fine. That's not our coverage model, so I don't have to maintain all those extra sites, which is why I get to kind of go crazy on merges and things like that. So I'm happier. But what we do is we actually, in terms of reporting for industries and things like that, we do two things with our firmographics. The first is for segmentation and employee count, so like things that would qualify as size for a particular customer, we write a formula field that goes back to the global HQ and says, okay, globally, how many employees do they have? And that becomes our segment line across everything, and that's how we could do something like, what size is this customer? And we treat it the same way for every subsidiary. The only example that's an exception to that is something like a holding company, so like Berkshire. We don't have Berkshire up here. In fact, we don't use Berkshire at all. We have like Dairy Queen and the trains and the real estate and whatever else as the global HQ. And so we do those as exceptions. But for location, things like are they in Europe? Are they in maybe Latin America is an emerging market for you, and so your renewal rates in Latin America are not very good. In that case, our formula fields reference this, which is going to be, in the example of Sony, we'll have Sony Japan, Japan, and we'll have Sony Japan, Sony USA, New York. And so when we report on the renewals from a locations perspective, we're actually comparing New York versus Japan from this domestic layer. Okay, so that's how we think about firmographics. We did have to have quite a few meetings with Data.com engineering to kind of like be happy with that. And I do still think if you have a lot of business in international markets, then you probably do need like another data provider, because DNB has some pretty obvious gaps in those places. And I'm sure that DataFox people who are here are really happy to hear me say that. So anyway, that's kind of my firmographics pitch. Any other questions? Cool. All right. I hope this was a good session for you guys. So thank you.